Hey folks, Matt Easton here. So we're going to be looking today at the Roman Pilum again, which obviously I've looked at in a number of videos before. If you haven't seen those, check the playlist below. But today we're going to be looking specifically at the Pilum versus armour. Armour of the time, that is of course the Roman Republic and Imperial periods. And this is a big question which relates to the fact that I've long held the belief that the primary purpose of the Roman Pilum, unlike the conventional wisdom that says that it's supposed to bend in a shield and make the person drop a shield, the primary person is for penetration, additional extra deep penetration through shields and through all sorts of things, but we'll examine that a little bit more in this video. Now before I go on, I just want to do a shout out to our sponsors who are making the purchase of all of these assets for these videos possible, and they are Raid Shadow Legends. I'm sure you know by now, Raid is the hugely popular mobile and PC based turn-based fantasy combat game. Most of you guys watching this channel know that Raid sponsor a lot of my videos, so thanks to them for that. And I do play Raid regularly actually, it's a really fun game, and I even managed to rank as 7th place on a recent tournament. Raid's free to download and free to play. It's a really fun game to play quickly, anytime you want. I play it probably most days actually, and you can build your team in whatever way you like. You can develop your characters in trillions of different ways. So because I've been playing for a while now and I play fairly regularly, I thought I'd give you some tips, particularly for new players. So if you're new to the game, it's really important to log in every day if possible, but as often as possible, because you get daily rewards and they're relative to days played. So when you log in, you get rewards. And when you're a new player, those rewards will actually make a big difference. They enable you to progress your players, get new characters even, because you get shards. Next thing that's really important is have a look at the quests. So there are certain objectives, and if you complete those objectives a certain number of times, you get reward. This is where you claim your rewards for doing quests, and I've done 4 out of 4 of upgrading accessories, upgrading artifacts. So there we go, I claim my reward. And again, I get to claim the rewards because I completed a quest. I summoned 3 champions, so I can claim my reward. Right, next really important thing is to look at the dungeons and what dungeons are open. And when dungeons are open, go in there and complete as many of the levels as you can. A lot of you will probably find, like me, it's very difficult to get past level 7, so they get basically progressively more difficult as you fight through. But each time you complete a level, you get rewards which enable you to power up your characters, or artifacts, for example, new weapons, new helmets, breastplates, shields, all this kind of stuff. So you can basically make your team tougher and tougher and tougher by fighting in those dungeons, and you can fight in them repeatedly. So it's really worth going in there. Whenever a dungeon is open, go in there, kill as many of the enemy as possible, get as many things as you can, level up. And lastly, this is a really important tip, with your characters, focus on a few of them and make them really, really good. If you have a team of 4 or 5 players, depending which format you're playing in, then if you've got just 1 or 2 people who are really super, super tough, that benefits the whole team and makes your whole team much, much tougher. Here one of my characters, called the Fencer, appropriately, has reached maximum level 30, so I'm going to attempt to upgrade her rank by sacrificing some other people. You can only upgrade rank when they get to the maximum level for the rank they're currently at. Who do I actually want to sacrifice? That's the difficult thing, is choosing. I've never used that person, so I'll upgrade. Use them and him. And I don't like that guy. There we go. Yes, sacrifice. Yes! So I've now got a 4-star instead of a 3-star Fencer. For more information and advice, subscribe to our special marathon for new players. So what's new in Raid for October? Well, Raid's just released the Artifact Forge, where you can save time and craft artifacts directly, as well as a whole new advanced quest system with amazing rewards. And that's not all. They also brought out some amazing new champions, and they're developing the amazing looking Doom Tower as we speak, which I'm super excited about. So go right now to the description below this video and click on the links there. If you're a new player, you'll get 100,000 silver plus 1 free champion called the Slasher. Remember, these rewards are only available to new players and only for the next 30 days. All of these rewards will be waiting for you up here in the inbox or treasure box that's up there. If you need advice, you're not alone. Subscribe to the guide on Teleria and find out the truth about Raid Shadow Legends. Follow the link. So thanks for staying with us, and now let's get back to the weapon testing. In this case, the Roman Pilum versus armour. First of all, let's have a little look at the Pilum being used. So these are made by Fabrica Cacti, linked below, and they make Roman arms and armour and equipment. And these are pretty good replicas of Roman pila of the period. Some of the replicas that you find out there, these shafts are too thin and too fragile compared to the originals. These, as has been shown in previous tests, are fairly strong, fairly robust. They will bend under the right circumstances, but they don't bend that easily. So the conclusion that we found in the past when testing against shields was that indeed, occasionally they do bend in a shield, but this is more sort of occasional circumstance. It's not the primary purpose of them, in my view, based on the replicas, based on the originals, based on now extensive testing. The primary purpose is to penetrate through the shield. Here we have a Roman scutum of the type being used during the imperial period, sort of middle to later Roman period, and this is the type of shield that Roman soldiers themselves would have used, but you've also got to remember this is what a lot of their opponents would have been using as well. And if not necessarily the Roman scutum, there were other types of shield as well. Auxilia tended to have oval flat shields, but if they were coming up against Gauls or Britons or Germans or Iberians or whoever, they had their own types of large shield, and they were roughly comparable, certainly when we're talking about the use of the Pilum specifically. And obviously when you've got a large shield like that protecting a large amount of your body, one of the problems for an opposing force is, well, how do we launch missiles at that force? How do we have an effect on that force when they've got these large shields protecting their bodies and in some cases being held away from the body? And as I have shown in previous videos, the length of the Pilum shaft is enough to penetrate through the shield and possibly into the person behind. I used this medieval style heater shield, which is made of the same kind of thickness, in this case plywood, not super authentic, certainly not for the medieval period, but actually for the Roman period there is some evidence of ply-like construction being used for the Roman scuta. And you'll notice that these holes through here were put through by the Pilum. Let's have a little reminder of what the Pilum does to this shield, which is a similar thickness to that Roman scutum I've just shown. So as you see there, we got that degree of penetration, maybe about 10 inches through the shield in the middle and straight into the target behind. Again, that much penetration through, and that's stopping in the hard straw target behind. If there wasn't anything there, it would push through all the way through, thanks to the design, all the way up probably to the base of the socket, and possibly hit the person behind. Now, we know therefore that the Pilum penetrates shields. Certainly these shields, maybe the thickest pavises made in the late medieval period maybe would stop them. Probably they would, but against the types of shields in use during the Roman period, and some shields which were not as tough as these plywood shields made of modern materials with modern glue in them, some of them I think the Pilum would have gone straight through. Certainly wicker types of shield, any types of leather shield, and certainly wooden shields of a similar thickness to this. If they were made of a plank construction, then they would be likely to split, and of course the Pilum would pass through. Now the question is, what happens to the person holding the shield? So people during the Roman era wore all sorts of armour, everything from literally nothing, in the case of the Britons famously, and some of the Gauls described as wearing nothing at all when they went into battle, just having a shield in their weapon, to then some people having forms of fabric or material, obviously clothing. They might just have basic clothing, or they might have types of perhaps linothorax in the early Roman period, which we're not entirely, we don't really know how they were constructed, but types of fabric armour, perhaps types of leather armour in some cases, or made of other more organic materials. right the way through mail armour. Now the mail armour, chainmail as it's commonly called these days, was adopted by the Romans, seems to have been taken from the Gauls or perhaps the Iberians, but anyway, the Celts as they're collectively known these days. Mail, chainmail, and we're going to have a look at some riveted mail, and then also all the way up to types of plate armour, both of bronze and of iron or perhaps low-grade steel, but we'll talk about that in a second. And plate armour could take various forms. It could be types of scale armour, or it could be literally lorica segmentata. Now, we're not going to test any helmets in this, but before we talk a little bit more about materials, one thing we have to bear in mind is that shape of armour is very, very important. Now, obviously mail armour tends to conform to the body, more or less, so it's flat-ish. So it doesn't have any deflective quality, and we'll see that in a little bit. But plate armour does have a deflective quality, and clearly when something is helmet shaped, for example, it will glance off. Now, we're not going to be testing helmets today. Maybe we'll do that in the future. I think we'll probably be doing that with medieval weapons rather than the Pilum, but who knows what's possible. Anyone who wants to sponsor the channel with Roman era helmets, I'm very happy for you to do that. Now, helmets are very, very deflective because they are just about the most bowl-shaped object that you can find, certainly in the classical era. But what we're going to have a look at are a simulator for mail. Well, in fact, we're going to look at riveted mail, and we're going to look at a simulator for lorica segmentata. So first up, I have some riveted chainmail here, and this is the edge off what was an aventail that I cut off a long, long time ago to make the aventail smaller. So it's surplus to requirement, but still nevertheless useful. So I'm sacrificing a part of it for this test. Now you will notice this is 8mm round section riveted Indian-made mail. Now there are a few things comparing this to mail of the classical era. So first of all, Roman lorica hamata, as it was called, so mail shirt, tended to be smaller rings than this. Okay, now smaller rings generally give better coverage and better protection on average. Okay, but this is made of mild steel. Most of their mail would have been made of wrought iron, and it would have had a fairly high slag content as well. So the material here is stronger, but the weave is a little bit larger. Make of that what you may. This is the mail that I have available, even if I had 6mm mail to sacrifice for this test. 6mm mail in modern steel wouldn't necessarily be exactly the same as Roman iron mail, but nevertheless, and the other thing I would say about the size of this, whilst the Romans used very small links, some of the people they were fighting against, be it the Gauls or the Persians or whoever, other people who used mail armour would have had larger links like this. So this is representative of some mail armour that would have been used in the period, although as I say, the material, this is actually better and tougher than most of the stuff that would have been made back then. So let's see what the Pilum does to the mail. That looked promising. So it went straight into the mail. Let's see what it actually did. So very interesting, kind of as I expected to, it blasted through the mail. It actually burst one of the rivets, okay? So it burst one of the rings and then forced straight through. And the thing with the Pilum is it's not a very big shaft, and obviously this relates to later angons as well in the Anglo-Saxon and kind of Viking era. But once it's made that hole, it only needs to burst one ring, much like an arrow, only needs to burst one ring. And once it's burst one ring, it can just travel through because nothing behind on that shaft is any thicker. It doesn't need to make a bigger hole. So once it's made a big enough hole for the head, it just carries on through. And it went the full depth of the archery target, but didn't quite stick out the rear. But you have to point out an archery target is a tougher target than a person's body, than a person's rib cage or stomach, for example. So that is very, very definitely through mail, even if there'd been clothing underneath. And some of you may be saying, gambesons, there weren't any gambesons in this period. There was something like a subarmalis, but we don't really know how they were constructed, and they seem to have been pretty thin. So for the most part, mail shirts were either worn amazingly on bearskin or on just clothing, basically. And even as late as the Bear Tapestry in the, and right the way through the Anglo-Saxon and Frankish periods, it does seem that mail shirts were usually worn just over clothing, not over padding. Padding is a bit of a modern reenactorism for those periods anyway. So it went straight through the mail. I'm going to give it another go and just check that the same thing happens. It doesn't greatly surprise me based on tests I've done with arrows on chainmail or mail, and the fact is that they go through it. And the Pilum, if anything, I think, certainly at short range, at this range, has more impact force than really most bows until you get up to extremely high draw weights. Because although it's slow moving, it's a very weighty object. It doesn't flex, it doesn't break. As you've seen maybe in Todd's arrow tests, the arrows, when they hit a hard target like armour, very often break because they just can't take that impact energy because it's a thin shaft. A Pilum or a javelin is not usually going to break. It's much thicker, much heavier. It's just going to carry on going straight and put all of that energy into the target. So let's have another go with the mail. Looks good, let's go and see. So that seems to have gone pretty much straight in. Let's try not to walk onto the back end of the pointy Pilum. So there you go, straight in. And for anyone thinking, so there are copper rings around the edge of what there was an aventail, but it hasn't gone through the copper ring, it has actually gone through an iron ring. Exactly the same as before. It's burst one of the rings and then it's passed through. Have a little look at the depth. Oh wow, okay, so it's gone right the way through the archery target and is embedded in the wood of the stand behind. It's actually split. Wow, it's actually broken. It's actually broken the archery stand. Great, I'll have to fix that. So there you go. You may not think I'm the strongest javelin thrower in the world, but clearly I'm strong enough to throw javelin through mail, through an archery target, and break the wooden stand behind. So there we go, conclusive, I think. Mail armour will not stop a Roman Pilum. Now obviously some of you will be saying, yeah, but Matt, first of all the javelin's got to pass through the shield, then it's got to hit the mail behind. This is all indicative. We're doing things in isolation at the moment. Maybe in a later test I'll put everything together, but we've now seen what will happen if it hits the shield. It will pass right the way through the shield to a good depth and hit something behind, and we've seen it can embed in an archery target behind the shield easily. Now we've seen it will go straight through mail, so if it doesn't hit the person's shield and someone's wearing a mail shirt and hits them in the mail shirt, basically they're kaput, okay? That javelin is still going to go right the way through their torso. As we saw, it went fully through an archery target and went into the wooden stand behind and broke the wooden stand behind. And that's with a 70% power throw from me. Yes, it's at close range, but as you know, I believe that these were used mostly at close range anyway. And even if you have two of these Pila and you throw one at longer range as the enemy are closing in, or as you're closing in on the enemy, the second javelin at least is going to go in at close range. So yes, they'll go through shields, yes, they'll go through mail. Now let's have a look at plate armour. So for the purposes of this test, plate armour, in this case an analogue for Lorica segmentata, is a little bit tougher for us to actually test. First of all, Lorica segmentata, the plates vary in thickness. They're not consistent between different archaeologically found examples. And they tend to be relatively thin, actually. Now, what I'm choosing is a tougher target. This is modern mild steel. Original Lorica segmentata sometimes may have had enough carbon in it to be qualified as mild steel, but usually would have been only iron. Okay, so basically the more carbon you put into iron, eventually you get to mild steel, you put more carbon in, then you get to carbon steel, at which point you can heat treat and harden. In this period they did have carbon steel for blades, and swords usually would have been made of a medium carbon steel, but armour for the most part probably would have been iron rather than mild steel. Additionally, their armour would have been made using a bloomery process from iron ore, and it would have had slag and deposits in the material that would have made it weaker and more prone to failure. So this is better material that I'm using. Modern mild steel is usually got a higher carbon content and is much more consistent than Roman iron. I don't have access to Roman iron, unfortunately, or even medieval iron, so I'm going to use mild steel. This is 1.5mm, which is relatively thick, I think, compared to what most Lorica segmentata would have been. I think most of them would have had plates of more like 1mm, but so this is 1.5mm, and it is a tougher modern material. One sheet I have done flat, one sheet I have done curved. This is for obvious reasons, I hope, because some of the plates in Lorica are, at the point of impact, would be relatively speaking flat. Okay, so whilst overall most of the plates are curved, relative to the angle that the weapon is coming in at, it might be flat at a given point. Some of the shoulder defences, for example, the way they come over the shoulder down here, the plates are basically flat here. Equally, if you hit square on the front of someone's torso, whilst there's a slight curve to it, it is almost flat at the point of impact. This curved one is just really to see if there's any difference. I think one of the things we're going to find is the curved one is probably going to absorb some energy because it will collapse and take force like a bridge, whereas the flat one, whilst it will also absorb force, it won't have as far to go because it will be a flat plate on a flat archery target. Anyway, let's give it a go and see what happens. One final thing I want to mention as well is that the hardness of the missile head plays a very large part in this, and the peeler being used, the two Pilum that I have here, are, I believe, mild steel or low carbon steel heads. So they will crush, they will deform, they are not as effective as a hardened steel head. These do not have hardened steel heads on them. So first up, let's have a go on the flat steel plate. So that was interesting. It has put a considerable dent in the plate, but it did not go through. Also, the tip of the Pilum is curled over, you can probably see. This material is really no harder than this material. This is mild steel. If this was a hardened steel head, it might have a slightly different result. Let's try again anyway. So, the tip is still slightly curled. I didn't bother sharpening it. I decided to just throw it as is. Interestingly, we got through the plate. I just put a bit more force into it basically. So I'm usually throwing at about 60% force. I upped that to about 80. And we've got a clean hull. However, that being said, it did not pass through enough. You can see there. It did not pass through enough. It would have wounded, but not fatally, and probably not particularly seriously. Pretty nasty. You wouldn't want that sticking in you, but nevertheless, especially if it had passed through a shield initially, 1.5mm mild steel is definitely doing its job. Let's have another go. Again, we have penetration, folks, but slightly less than last time. We've still got a rolled tip. In fact, the tip is even slightly more rolled than it was even before. So we're getting penetration through 1.5mm modern mild steel. Not enough to seriously injure someone, but certainly enough to really annoy them. Let's have another go. Almost identical to the previous one. So we've got a hull with about 1 centimetre of the head going through. I'm actually just going to switch out to my other Pilum, which has got a sharper head. I mounted it up this morning, so just to see if it makes any difference at all. Sharp and pointy. Ow! Bit of an interlude there as I had to fix my archery target as the peeler have completely destroyed it. Anyway, I've glued it and tied it back together. Let's have another go with that sharp Pilum. So I made a new hole, not a particularly massive hole, it came at a cost. So the disadvantage of being finer tipped and sharper is it's completely curled the tip, as you can see there. So at this point now, what was the blunter Pilum has now become the sharper Pilum. So there's an interesting point here that obviously there's a relativity of material strength. If we're throwing against mild steel and we've got a mild steel head, well, clearly a large flat surface and a little pointy surface, the pointy surface is going to give way and collapse. This is a similar result to what we find when we look at medieval arrowheads, when we look at long thin bodkins which are designed to be used against mail or perhaps even gambeson. When they hit plate armour they often deform and bend. However, we know that in the medieval period they were using hardened heads. We don't know if these Pilum heads were hardened. If they were, it would make a difference, and I'd like to try this again with hardened heads at some point, but at the moment I'm using mild steel heads which may be historically accurate. However, we have to say that the plate is probably stronger in terms of the material, perhaps even in terms of thickness as well, compared to the Lorica segmentata armour that was being used at the time. Right, I'm going to resharpen these Pilum heads, and then I'm going to have a go on the curved plate. Okay, so I've just fixed the tip on what was the formerly very pointy one, just to say that I used my angle grinder, my authentic Roman angle grinder, to put more of a robust chisel tip on the end. Based on what I'm seeing here, certainly against plate, be different against mail or soft targets, but against plate I want a slightly more supported point, not a fine, well, not a slender point, but a more robust point, like we'd see on medieval so-called armour-piercing heads, but chisel cutters and things like that. But let's have a go on the curved plate now with my two peeler. So a couple of interesting things happened there. First of all, what was a curved plate is no longer really a curved plate. Now that actually has some potential scientific ramifications for Lorica segmentata, because of course it definitely wasn't sprung steel. It would have been soft, at most low carbon steel, and probably iron. So if it was hit by a Pilum like this, whilst it might not penetrate, it might bend it in such a way that it's not going to work very well thereafter, especially because the surrounding plates have to have the same curve, whether it's a shoulder plate or whether it's a torso plate. So if what was a curved plate now has a whopping great dent in it, it might now have an opening or a damage point in it, which enables you to exploit in close hand-to-hand combat. So even though you might not wound the person badly, they'll have a nasty bruise, I would think, at least. You may have disadvantaged them in some way. The second thing is this tip. So my theory worked correctly. There is a tiny bit of rounding, but the tip basically maintained its shape. So in my view, what you want, certainly if you're going to be going up against hard objects, is actually a sharp but more supported and robust point. Let's have another go on the curved plate. Again, very interesting result. My point, being a more robust point, is now keeping its shape. It's flattening slightly at the tip, but it's not curling. Now, we have a hole. We have a hole in the plate. It is relatively insignificant. The tip barely even sticks through the other side, but it has broken the plate. But interestingly again, what was a curved plate is now a flat plate, and you'll notice it knocked the supported archery target and stand over. So it's hitting with a lot of force, akin to a swing from a poleaxe or something like that, like a sledgehammer hit, something like this. It's heavy force, enough to flatten with one blow that curved piece of mild steel. And yeah, it is mild steel, and I can bend it again. But if that's part of your armour, bearing in mind they did not have spring or hardened plate at this time, if that's hitting the middle of your lorica segmentata, it's going to bend it, it's going to deform it, it might lock it up, stop the plates working against each other, it might create an opening between the plates. Very interesting. Let's have another go. Oscar. Naughty cat. Once again, failure to penetrate, but the plate very much flattened. So, kind of as expected, when the plate is curved, it absorbs a lot more shock. It deforms, which I wasn't expecting it to deform as much as it did, but it massively reduces penetration, I would say. I'm having another final go on the flat plate again. I'll tell you what, I might even just flatten this plate out and have a go on this, because it does make a considerable difference. And this is something very important to bear in mind when people are doing tests on things like breastplates or whatever, is how supported they are, how set up to absorb energy they are. Remember, when something is on someone's body, like the archery target there that got knocked over, it can absorb that energy by being knocked back, obviously if it's armour on a person's body. But remember that soft iron, and even in the medieval period, most armour was not made of hardened steel. Most armour was made of something akin to mild steel or low carbon steel or iron. It would deform when it was hit. So even if you don't penetrate it, you might deform it. You might, in some cases, create a situation whereby that armour has to be taken off for the person to carry on functioning as a soldier. You know, it might have other ramifications. But let's have another go on the flattened plate, just to remind ourselves of what the Pilum can do. And I tell you what, I'm going to stand closer, I'm going to put as much force into it as I can. It's worth reminding you how much penetration we're getting through an archery target here. That is a lot of energy. Definitely a more significant hole, but still not enough to create a serious wound. So there we go, folks. I think by optimizing the scenario, flat plate, very close range, me putting a lot of welly into it, that about matches the deepest one that I got earlier. It's maybe 1.5 centimeters, 2 centimeters. Yeah, probably about 2 centimeters through. So unpleasant, but by no means fatal, and very much just an annoyance. But we have learned some interesting things here. And I must reiterate that this is 1.5mm modern mild steel. This is not necessarily a good analogue for lorica segmentata, but I honestly don't know what a good analogue for lorica segmentata. It should be slaggy iron, I would expect, wrought iron, or very low carbon steel, so maybe similar to this. Was it 1.5mm? I suspect that most lorica segmentata was probably slightly thinner than that. Maybe 1mm, 1.2mm, slightly thinner than this. And it was curved, and we've learnt a lot here, both about the material of the heads of these, how you want to shape the heads of these, and potentially also the ramifications for getting hit by one of these in lorica segmentata. But we shouldn't forget that this went straight through riveted mail with no problem. It went straight through archery target at close range, almost up to the base of the socket, with no real problem. It went straight through shields, so this is a very, very potent weapon, and perhaps lorica segmentata was really very, very effective for its time. I suspect it was. And we should also remember that mail as well could be doubled up, so some elements of the lorica hamata, or mail shirt worn by auxiliaries and Roman officers and stuff,
and Roman legionaries for quite a long time. In some places it was doubled, where the shoulder pieces came over, so you would have 2 layers of mail, and possibly over a submarmalis, which may be a few layers of linen, possibly a leather base to the mail, we don't know. And certainly scale armour, scale could be scale over the top of mail in some cases, and that would provide very good protection against things like this. So there we go, folks. I hope that's been educational and interesting. I've certainly had fun doing it and destroying these sheets of steel. Maybe I'll find another use for these as well. It's been educational for me, and I must be honest, I really now want to try the same thing with hardened steel heads, because I think the results would be slightly different if we had a harder head on these Pila. But were the originals hardened? I don't know. If you know evidence, anything to do with that, let me know. I don't want modern what modern people write about Pila. I want original source, primary source material. I will see you again soon on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Please share this video around, give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you really soon again for another video on this channel. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.